The title of this presentation is Contacting the Self. Before I get into the main ideas, I'd like to quote from the first stanza of the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. The Tao that can be talked about is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. As the origin of heaven and earth, it is nameless. As the mother of all things, it is nameable. Without desire, we contemplate its inner essence. Filled with desire, we look at its outer aspects. These two flow from the same source, though differently named, and both are called mysteries. The mystery of mysteries is the door of all essence. These words could easily be applied to the self, the true self, the inner self, and its relationship to the ego and to consciousness. The ego names things, the self is nameless. The ego is filled with desire, the self is desireless. Yet in essence, they are the same. Jung often quoted from an ancient philosopher, God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. He applied these same ideas to the self. So what is the self? The self is the totality and essence of our being. It's every aspect of ourselves. It includes our body, it includes our psyche, it includes the unconscious, it includes our soul, whatever that is. And it has no enduring shape or form. So in that sense, we cannot know it or grasp it with our mind. Why? Because our mind is part of our ego, and the ego is part of the self. So it's as though a part is trying to encompass and understand the whole, which is not possible because the self encompasses the ego and it extends far beyond ordinary consciousness into all different aspects which we might experience, including transcendent experiences and higher levels of consciousness. So what does Jung say about the self? The self, as the essence of individuality, is unitemporal and unique. As an archetypal symbol, it is a God image and therefore universal and eternal. What he is trying to explain with this quotation is that the self does not exist in time. It seems to be unique to each individual, but it is also archetypal in that sense. It's shared amongst everybody. And it holds an image of something sacred, what he calls the God image, the urge towards transcendence. The self then functions as a union of opposites. All the parts of ourselves which struggle together are integrated and one in the self, and thus constitutes the most immediate experience of the divine, which is psychologically possible to imagine. So it's a oneness, a monad, a wholeness, which resolves and integrates all opposites. So here's another set of quotations from Jung on the self. The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. So this quote is very similar to the one I talked about earlier from the ancient philosopher about God being both the center that's everywhere and the circumference which is nowhere. The self is bigger than anything we can imagine. It's more complex than we can get our minds around. And in some sense, our ego does not know very much about it because the self embraces ego consciousness. It embraces the shadow. It embraces the anima, the female aspect if you're a man, or the animus, the male aspect if you're a female, and the collective unconscious in indeterminable extension. It's saying that it's beyond our capacity to capture it. And for this reason, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. The ego is part of the self and tends towards inflation. Its job is to keep us alive, to keep us functioning in this world. When we connect to the self, the ego feels threatened because it feels as though it's going to dissolve. And therefore, The experience of the self is a threat. How do we experience the self? We experience the self in moments of awe, inspiration, and transcendence. These do not come very often, but we all have these transpersonal, numinous experiences. Whether we capture these experiences depends on how much we value them and how much we pay attention to them. We also experience the self in numinous or big dreams. These are a reflection of the self. Nightmares and big dreams are often messages from the whole self and not simply some aspect of the unconscious. Not all our dreams comes from the personal unconscious. Sometimes they come from something much bigger than ourselves. The self expresses itself through our inner nature and life purpose. Our inner nature is the true essence of the self. It has certain aspects, certain qualities. We're born with them and they tend to develop as we grow and as we change. And it has a certain quality of engagement with the world, our inner self. And our nature has talents, specific abilities which seem to be inherent in us. And those talents can only be expressed if we are living our life purpose, if we're doing something which connects truly to ourself. If we don't connect to ourselves, life has only superficial meaning. We do not have that sense of deep inner satisfaction that comes from following our purpose. The self also has a quality of knowing that is beyond ego understanding. We can know without understanding. We can have an inner feeling, a spontaneous intuition which goes beyond thought. And it's this sense of knowing which has no emotional charge to it, which just seems to come out of the blue unexpectedly, is something that tells us our self is engaged and involved in our life. How do we approach the self? Well, we cannot control our experience of the selves. That's the function of the ego. So we have to approach the self through stillness, through surrender and letting go of the ego. We have to go beyond the ego. We have to get to a place when we're not trying to control things, we're not judging things, we're not trying to be the center of attention, trying to be that special. We have to get to a place beyond that, a place of emptiness, of stillness. And every religion teaches that this is the only path to the self. We need to be patient, open, reverent. What I mean by that is the self is sacred. In some sense, you could say the self is God. The self is thusness. The self is Buddha nature. So we have to approach it with a certain reverence, and we have to appreciate the fact that it's doing everything that it can for us. When we try to co-opt or colonize our self-experiences, which the ego constantly tries to do, they tend to slip away. We tend to lose that sense of connection to something greater because we're trying to capture it with something smaller. So we approach the self by listening to our inner guidance. We can do this in dreams, but we can do it also in what I would call receivings. What I mean by receivings is that these are the unexpected information that comes to us beyond our mind, beyond our will, beyond our wanting and desire. It seems to come to us from something else. These are gifts. These are things which we can only receive, we cannot control or expect. So the self is our Dharma. It's our guidance system. It's our aspirations. It's the expression of our wish to transcend. And this guidance is always trying to help us become more than we are, more than our simple ego. So we approach the self through stillness, surrender, and all of these are facilitated by traditional spiritual practices like prayer, like meditation, fasting, retreat, ritual, pilgrimage. The most common, of course, is prayer and meditation. And in some sense, those are essentially the same practice. They're a way of quietening the ego, getting still, of letting go. Prayer often is asking for something, but it's asking for something in service of the true self. meditation is becoming empty, of allowing a space beyond the ego for something to arise. Fasting is a way of curbing our desires, of strengthening our will. Retreats are taking ourselves away from the demands, the distractions of the world. Ritual is, in some sense, very simply a dream on the outside. It is like taking our inner world and doing it as an action outside. It does not have a rational basis, it has a ritual, imaginal, numinous basis. And pilgrimage, of course, is what you might call a journey with an intention to connect with the sacred, which also includes some sort of ordeal. It has to have some sense in which you're struggling somewhat with your ego and its desires and wishes. I talk more about spiritual practices in a video that I did for Interface a couple of years ago. I'd like to finish this very short presentation with a story from one of my favorite books called Tales of a Magic Monastery. It's by Father Theophane, calls himself Theophane the monk. He was a monk at St. Benedict's Trappist Monastery in Snowmass. He's an old, scrawny looking monk with a big bushy beard and very wild eyes. He looked like a patriarch from a Zen story. He had this quality of intensity and imagination, and he's one of the most fascinating people I have ever met. His Sunday sermons were extraordinary. They were conversational, yet profoundly moving. This is a short story entitled The Great Debate. I had been a few years in another monastery, and things were not going well. I persuaded someone to inquire around and find out what the other monks thought of me. His report: they call you nobody. That was terrible to hear. Some of the people in my head started shouting in a rage, "No, I'm somebody, somebody." Others moaned, "No, it's true, you are nobody." The great debate. It went on and on for months, all in my head. It wore me out. Somebody, nobody, somebody, nobody. One night, someone came into my room, got on his knees, and put his forehead to the ground. I thought he was mocking me, so I just ignored him. After a while, I gained courage and began to curse at him. When finally I spat at him, he spoke, "Please come to the magic monastery." I tried to make some reply, but the words came out all stutters and stammers. That debate was tearing me apart. He just put out his hand. I took it and followed him. As we walked up the path to the great door, the bells began to ring as if there was a great feast. The abbot came to greet me and led me into a huge hall. He placed me in the center, and the monks and nuns, hundreds of them, came and sat all around me. Someone brought the candle from the sanctuary to set in front of me, and so we sat all through the night. Now, you might say they sat in silence, their eyes closed, but this is the magic monastery. My experience was different. I heard them chanting, "Somebody, somebody, at last, welcome, welcome." I heard the abbot tell them how I had just got in from Egypt. We were all breathing as one. Someone invited me to sing for them. I said I couldn't sing, but I'd tell them a few jokes. One said, it was good to have a new perspective. Then someone called out, "You can sing." So I sang. I sang the song of my life, my past, my present, my future. It was so beautiful.